The Christmas Truce of the First World War is now something of legend, a moment when two opposing armies lay down their weapons to embrace the festive season and stop the fighting for just one day. It has been framed as a demonstration that the men fighting the war didn't want to continue, and it was only the officers that ensured that the killing continued. A football match was said to have been played between British and German soldiers in another show of solidarity and peace. But how much of this is true? Was it a spontaneous outbreak of peace and love? Did a football match actually take place? In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the events preceding the truce and examine how the men of the British Army in particular viewed the event, and try to separate the myth from reality. But first, we have to start at the beginning and understand the wider context in which the truce began. In the winter of 1914, two continuous lines of trenches faced one another from the North Sea to the border of Switzerland. These two front lines had been created by the German attack through Belgium and France in the late summer of that year. After the initial reversal of the German army on the Marne, they fell back to defensive locations. This left them in a very strong position, having internal lines of communication between their eastern and western fronts, meaning they could reinforce where it was needed wherever necessary. For the Western allies of France and Britain, it was essential that pressure was applied on the German army in order to try to shift them out of France and Belgium, and also to help relieve pressure on the Russians. For Britain, the ideal outcome was the removal of the German army from around the Channel ports, the control of which had served as a catalyst in previous conflicts, going back as far as Elizabethan times. However, in 1914, Britain was very much the junior party in the alliance, and there was no way that Sir John French, as the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, was in a position to dictate Allied strategy. Both John French and Ferdinand Foch, the second in command of the French army, recognised as early as November 1914 the need for huge amounts of material and men if they were to stand any chance of breaking the German lines. However, political pressure from the Allies' current situation meant that waiting was just not an option. Also, it was not clear if the German army had simply gone on the defensive to rest before striking a new fresh attack in the west. It would take another 4 years of attritional warfare for the Allies to break the German army. However, in 1914, nobody had the power of foresight. Despite these reservations already being in place, Foch consulted with Joseph Joffre, the Commander-in-Chief of the French army, about the overall strategy that the Allies should adopt. The attacks would concentrate on the north and south of the salient bulge created by the German army in northern France and Belgium. This would be an effort to snip off that bulge. With the overall strategy in place, in early December, Foch has decided that an attack would take place in Arras and Champagne with the assistance of the BEF. The place was decided partly due to reports that the Germans were transferring units from the west in this area. Britain was obliged to take part in this operation as a smaller Western ally, but this was much against the wishes of John French. It was going to be the first time that the BEF had assaulted enemy trenches on a continuous western front. Foch had envisioned a broad attack across the entire front line, north and south of the British-held areas, with the BEF taking part along their front. After consultation with his subordinate commanders on the 12th of December, John French's plan was of a staggered attack by 2nd and 3rd Corps against the area around the Messines Ridge. Meanwhile, 4th Corps would engage the enemy in small localised attacks to pin the enemy in place. The divisions of each corps were to stage their own attacks, beginning on the British left. They were to wait until the division on their left had achieved their objectives before beginning their own attack. This flew in the face of sound military planning and was at the very least unimaginative, and exposed each division in a narrow frontage attack with threats to the front, left and right as they advanced. It is beyond this video to go into the attacks between the 14th and the 19th of December in detail, and much more information can be found in Chris Baker's excellent book The Truce, the Day the War Stopped, but it is sufficient to say that the attacks were an unmitigated disaster. This was much in part to the poor planning given to each operation, the lack of artillery support both in the minimal barrages fired and the inefficiency of the shells to cut the German wire. These factors were compounded by the units being unprepared for the ground over which they were to fight, and the atrocious conditions which they were going to fight in. In 1917, the British Army would attack over the same ground. However, meticulous planning, a highly developed artillery plan and well-trained troops swept away the German defences. In 1914, the British Army was at the bottom of what has become known as the learning curve. The Indian Corps also took part in the overall operation, attacking around Givenchy but gaining little ground. A German retaliation was swift and brutal on the 20th and 21st of December, with the bombardment in driving rain followed by one of the first underground mine explosions of the war. Though much smaller than the mining operations to come, this still had the effect of killing men and sapping morale in what were already terrible conditions. However, despite the onslaught, the ground was held and the Germans were thrown back by the 23rd. And although fighting continued until the 24th of December, things began to calm down somewhat. The areas between the trenches were now littered with the corpses and the wounded of the units who'd attacked and fought in the area, as most of the battalions involved in the fighting had lost to over 200 men. The German 7th Corps reported losses of around 1,250 men. Indeed, at some points in a lull in the previous day's fighting, localised truces had occurred to allow for the removal of wounded and the burial of the dead. There were two main aspects to this. One was of basic humanity, and the other of hygiene, not wanting rotting corpses close to an already wet and muddy trenches. For the most part, these were peaceful affairs, but casualties still occurred, and prisoners were taken by both sides. Also, this wasn't along the entire front line, but it was an indication of things to come in the next few days. Back at home, in both Germany and Britain, the lead up to Christmas was being celebrated with various schemes and calls for supplies to be sent to the men fighting on the front. These included the famous Princess Mary's Appeal, when the British and Indian soldiers, sailors and nurses received small present tins of cigarettes, sweets, chocolates or writing materials. Although Christmas in 1914 wasn't the commercial affair of today, it was certainly a morale boost to both the men on the front and their families at home. The Germans also received similar gifts from various German commanders and civilian manufacturers. So let's turn to the truce. We have to understand the evidence that can be explored to try to get a true account if possible of what happened of the event. A plethora of letters were written to newspapers, sometimes anonymously, in the months that followed. These described the truce and meeting Germans in no man's land. However, we have to remember that some of these newspapers, eager for stories, paid for them, somewhat skewing the writer's requirements to tell the truth. A letter saying nothing happened was less likely to be published and therefore not paid for than one that described in great detail the truce, whether the men took part or not. The first indications to the public back home that a truce had occurred were two anonymous letters which first appeared in the Cheltenham Chronicle and the Daily Mail on the 26th of December. Both described chatting to the Germans in the trenches opposite and an exchange of cigarettes and chocolate in the latter. These two letters were written close to the time, and although they are anonymous, they do have the feeling of legitimacy about them. In his book, Chris Baker explored the official war diaries of each of the battalions of the British Army that held the front line on the 25th of December 1914. This was done in great detail, and I thoroughly recommend his book on the subject. Each battalion kept a record of its activities throughout the period of the war, and these can be accessed through the National Archives. They describe day-to-day events, including where the men were billeted, where attacks took place, details of casualties, and where the unit was on each day of service. The diaries were completed by officers, and there is a massive difference in the amount of information they hold depending on who was writing them, when they were written, and under what circumstances they were written, along with other factors. And we have to keep this in mind. However, they are amongst some of the best official documentation that we have to work with from a historical point of view about the Christmas Truce. 25th of December 1914 saw a break in the previous bad weather, with the rain clearing and temperatures falling to create a frost and a somewhat hard ground in no man's land. Mist also moved in to obscure the front lines. The unit war diaries record a variety of occurrences on the 25th of December. Many mention men climbing out of both German and British front lines to bury the dead and collect the wounded, under unofficial localised truces. Some of these acts were nothing more than that, with some instances of British soldiers trying to keep the Germans away from their front line, or officers trying to take stock of the state of the German lines. In fact, the truce was a great way for gathering intelligence on the enemy, and it was used as such. It was also a chance for soldiers to ensure repairs were done to their own trenches and barbed wire erected in no man's land with a tacit agreement that no firing would occur. In many other areas, a truce didn't occur at all. Records show that over 100 British soldiers were killed on Christmas Day. These casualties came from snipers and artillery mostly, but they demonstrate that in some places, due to the recent fighting, many units were not in the mood to observe a truce. The 2nd Grenadier Guards, for example, continued fighting throughout the day of the 25th, with Major Mark Jeffreys writing in his diary, "Hard frost and ground as hard as bricks. Dikes frozen over. At daybreak, a few Germans put their heads up and shouted, 'Merry Christmas!' Our men, after yesterday, were not feeling that way and shot at them. They at once replied, and a sniping match went on all day." But it is the fraternisation between the soldiers that gets the most attention, and this certainly happened in isolated areas. But again, it wasn't universal. In some areas, men climbed out of their trenches and met the enemy in no man's land. They exchanged cigarettes, chocolate and other treats that had been sent from home for the season. Many German soldiers had a good command of English, and there are many accounts of conversations about their previous lives in Britain, with some calls for personal items to be passed on to sweethearts. Singing broke out in some places, with soldiers on both sides singing their favourite hymns and popular songs of the time. Small pocket cameras were also produced by some men, and there are many pictures of German and British soldiers coming together for a few moments. It was strictly against orders to use cameras in the front lines for security reasons, but soldiers are very inventive, if nothing else. In most cases, as night fell, the men started to filter back to their own lines, and although it was quiet in some places for the next few days, the fraternisation was over. Although it was strictly against standing orders, and there is evidence of higher command forbidding fraternisation with the enemy, there is no evidence that men were punished for the events that occurred on the 25th. One of the most abiding myths of the Christmas Truce is that a football match took place between German and British soldiers in no man's land on Christmas Day. Actual evidence from the time is difficult to track down. Anonymous letters in newspapers appeared claiming this. But from a historical point of view, we simply cannot trust them, especially when the writers were paid for their words. The British Army diaries mention football being played, but only by British soldiers, against British soldiers, and mostly in rear areas. The 2nd King's Own Scottish Borderers War Diary mentions rumours about a football match between the British and Germans on the front line. However, the King's Own were in billets behind the lines on the 25th, so the writer was not there to witness the events, if they happened at all. In official accounts and personal accounts written at the time, there are definitely accounts of football matches being arranged for Boxing Day between the British and Germans. However, these never happened, due to the truce actually ending. A game was played by British soldiers in no man's land, but it did not include the Germans. Notwithstanding the difficulty of producing a football in an active frontline trench, many of the propositions were ended by officers disallowing it anyway. The main evidence for a football match being played by the opposing sides comes from a handful of German sources, namely 3 officers, Johannes Neumann, Hugo Klemm and Kurt Chemisch. Neumann appeared on BBC television shows in the 1960s, and he was adamant that a Christmas Day football match had taken place between his men of the 133rd Infantry Regiment and kilted Scottish soldiers. Klemm was a member of the same unit, and also mentioned playing against Scottish soldiers and discovering that they wore no underpants under their kilts. Closer inspection of these accounts reveals that the 133rd Infantry Regiment were in front of the 19th Brigade, which did indeed contain 2 Scottish battalions, the 1st Cameronians and the 2nd Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. Photographs of the Cameronians at the time show that they were wearing trousers and puttees in the front lines, and some cases gumboots due to the flooded nature of their trenches. That said, the 2nd Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders did wear khaki aprons over their kilts even in flooded trenches. Unfortunately, this is where the evidence from both sides of the lines diverges. Jack James was a former footballer and commanding a company of Cameronians next to the Argyll and Sutherlanders. He mentioned a football match being arranged between the Argyll and Sutherlanders and the Germans opposite, but that shellfire had precluded any fixture actually taking place. Other British accounts are also silent on a match actually taking place. Kurt Chemisch noted in his diary that a football match had taken place, but it is not clear that the match was only between British soldiers or actually between British and German soldiers. Chemisch also noted in his diary that a match was arranged to take place the next day, and this tallies with British accounts of men from the units opposite the 134th Infantry Regiment, to which Chemish belonged. However, the 134th Infantry Regiment was relieved the following day and no match took place. Finally, one thing should be mentioned in relation to the Christmas Day football match, and that is a curious tale of a particular Captain Peter Jackson. He had been interviewed as part of the BBC's flagship Great War series and confidently stated that he had been present at the football match as a junior lieutenant in the Wiltshire Regiment. Although his original interviews were not used in the Great War documentary series, he was invited back later for a programme dealing with the truce and was filmed in France along with Johannes Nijman. Nijman pointed out inconsistencies with Jackson's account. Some fact-checking later found that Peter Jackson wasn't a captain in 1914. He wasn't even a Peter, but he was actually named Albert Edward Jackson, and he had served as Lance Corporal in the 1st Wiltshire Regiment during Christmas of 1914. Given this, it is very difficult to accept his account of every football match ever taking place. So in summary, the Christmas Truce of 1914 was an event that didn't happen again in the next 4 years of war, and seems to have occurred more through a desire to get rid of wounded and dead soldiers from between the lines. Although fraternisation occurred and goodwill was shared in some areas of the British and German front line, it was by no means universal, and the war continued just as it had previously for many soldiers. The event became mythological over time, especially the supposed football match between British and German soldiers. A very difficult to pin down event, which now has a memorial dedicated to it. It was used by the Football Association and also in Christmas adverts and films and musical videos as central to the truce. Did a football match take place between opposing soldiers in 1914? The myth over time has become the truth, so whatever did happen on that cold Christmas day in 1914 may never be known with certainty.